Buenos días. Vamos a iniciar el segundo punto que tenemos en el programa con la presentación de los estudios de investigación, los informes realizados tanto por Eurosif, el presentado el día 23-24 de septiembre en Bruselas, sobre la presentación de Shareholder Stewardship, European ESG Engagement Practices, que al final estamos hablando de prácticas de engagement a nivel europeo, y tenemos para presentarnos pues la persona que mejor representa, el presidente de Eurosif, Giuseppe van der Helm, a mi derecha, que además es el director ejecutivo de UBDO, que luego participará también, una de las gestoras más importantes de Holanda. Seguidamente tenemos, en el programa teníamos la participación en representación de los PRI, de los principios de inversión responsable. Teníamos prevista la llegada de María Tinelli, por circunstancias sobrevenidas de última hora no ha podido venir, y le sustituye Karin Malberg, que está más a la derecha, y bueno, pues nos va a presentar los últimos informes de los PRI, bueno, Karin es la directora de implementación y desarrollo en el área de research de los PRI, y bueno, la singularidad es que la presentación será en castellano, a pesar de que ella nos lo va, las transparencias, perdón, serán en castellano y la presentación nos la hará en inglés. Digo, por quienes necesiten la traducción simultánea, igual que la presentación, en este caso de Josep, será en inglés. Bueno, agradecer a los dos invitados. Yo, por mi parte, presentaré el informe que les han entregado en la entrada y bueno, sin más, vamos a iniciar la exposición dando la palabra a Josep van der Helm. Agradecerles a los dos invitados su presencia aquí y bueno, lo dicho, sin más, iniciamos la presentación. Doctor.
Thanks a lot. And I also would like to start by thanking SpainSIF for organizing this conference. It's great to see so many people here in Spain that are really driven and interested, committed to the topic of sustainable investment. A topic which is not so easy. I was taking a taxi yesterday from the airport to my hotel, and I do not speak a lot of Spanish, but the taxi driver was speaking endlessly, and the only topic he was talking about was the crisis. And I didn't understand a lot, but the financial industry had a big say in this, and he was getting pretty frustrated. And then I said, yeah, but well, and then he was talking about taxes, and I said, but that's not the financial authority, that's the government. And he said, no, these are totally aligned, these two, financial community and the sector and the government, and that's in fact what's causing the crisis. And I asked him if he had any suggestions, because he made a good analysis, but he didn't have a lot of suggestions for how to solve it. But yeah, there's a lot of anger, that's what I found. Not only with taxi drivers. A couple of months ago, I was attending a session with the new director of the Dutch National Bank. And it was about the crisis. And this was another person who was talking about the crisis and his analysis. And it went on and on with all the banks in place and, you know, in the audience. And they were telling what to do and about solvency and of Basel and I don't know what. And at the end, we could ask questions. So I went to the mic, I said, yeah, I'm sitting here for 1 hour, I didn't hear a word about sustainability. I mean, after all, sustainability is long-term thinking. It has everything to do with financial stability. What about that? And without any hesitation, he immediately replied what he thought was the cause of the crisis. He said the crisis is caused by shareholder activism. We totally forgot about all the other stakeholders. It's shareholder activism. So apparently, at that level, engagement was thought to be very important. Now, if you look to the history, and now I'm starting a bit also to describe this report, because that's my job today, I think, at least here, about shareholder stewardship. Eurosif already looked into this matter in 2006, but then you look to the history, of course, there has been a total how you say that, in a disconnect between the ownership of a company and the management of a company. Normal people, yeah, they exist, cannot understand why, for instance, directors of banks, but let's be honest, it's many sectors, have to earn those crazy amounts of bonuses. It's not that I'm against a bonus, many people are, but there's a total disconnect between the objectives and what they're paid for. Normal people cannot understand it, but of course we are not normal people. We are working with the financial sector, we understand it's necessary because otherwise you cannot attract the right people, can you? Or can't you? I don't know. There's a disconnect. And how's it possible? Because there are no more normal people in the shareholder meetings. I attend many shareholder meetings, many general meetings. And what you see over there is that people that are there are either a couple of retired people that enjoy free coffee and beer, but most of them, of course, are institutional investors. And how sad is it to see when there's, after a hefty discussion in a room on a certain topic, could very well be bonuses, for instance, after a long discussion, that everybody has to vote, and the percentages are already known, 95, 96, 97%. I would tell you, even North Korea would have a problem getting those kind of scores on the table. But we let it happen. Why is that? Because even in the 90s, over 50% of the 1,000 largest companies in the world were owned by institutional investors. That's what we see happening everywhere. And that's where you see a disconnect also between the end of the line, the shareholders, because after all, somewhere owns or is a participant in a pension fund or buys an insurance, you know, so it's after all the consumers. They do not understand this anymore. One of the worst examples I remember was a kind of smaller AGM of a company which was listed in the Netherlands, but had nothing to do with the Netherlands at all. It was just there for fiscal reasons. It was a German-American company. And actually they were kind of old-fashioned voting by hand. And unbelievable, there was a crisis going on. This company did react by sacking a lot of the employees. So they sent kind of 500 employees home. Then they told the investors, shareholders, there would not be any dividend being paid this year or next year. And then next pointed the general salary, and then they said, well, we're going to give our supervisory board a 50% salary increase and ours a 20% salary increase. Well, nobody in that room had any understanding of what happened. And yet, what do you think? 90% agreed. Those were the institutional investors. So I hope this makes my case for the study, for the importance of engagement. Because if engagement, or perhaps a lack of engagement, led to these excesses, if you turn it around, you turn the flow the other way, it can do a lot of benefit for companies and for investors by creating value. So let's turn to the slides. And I think the key word in here, by the way, is I'll say a bit more at the end, is taking responsibility. Because even as an institutional investor, there's no reason why you should let go and just follow the management. You always have your own responsibility, your own thinking. I think the legislation changes that just were announced could help, because that forces an institutional investor like a pension fund or an insurance company to take up this responsibility and think what it means. And in my definition, responsibility is always more than legislation. You always have to go a step further, and that's not easy. It means that it requires thinking where you are. Luckily, you don't have to do it alone. There's your stakeholders that can help you. So this report of Eurosif, it tried to show the state of engagement in Europe. It built a case, and I hope I already started building that case. And it also says something about the policy changes that are needed to make. Now let's first look what is engagement in the definition of this report. Basically, you talk between investors and the management. That's it. So we did not take into account NGO engagement, for instance, however relevant that might be. And we also looked to institutional investors, both to the asset owners and the asset managers. We did not take a look so much to indirect engagement, but mostly direct contacts between companies and investors. And of course, the engagement should be around sustainability, meaning ESG standards, environmental, social, and governmental. There's a lot of definitions. I'm not going to take a lot of time taking you to all these definitions, but some keywords you see popping up. The keyword is long-term. Makes sense because sustainability has to do with long-term. The keyword is ownership mindset and value creation, of course. And it's often, it's interesting because the word stewardship means, of course, you do it on behalf of someone else. So you represent your own members or investors. If as an institutional investor, the money is not yours often, it's you have your own responsibilities to others. Now, how do you do that? Yeah, that means you have to take into account the ideas of others. One way of doing that is asking them. Simple, huh? So as a pension fund, if you don't know exactly whether you have to invest in certain sectors, you can just ask. And of course, if you're representing the military, I can understand you will invest in weapon industry, but if you represent, for instance, nurses and doctors, it would be quite strange. So the thing is here, there's not so much good and wrong, but at least you should do what your investors, your participants ask you to do or want you to do. So the definition of Eurosif, we say stakeholder dialogue, shareholder dialogue, with companies, of engagement is a shareholder dialogue with companies, including through in-person meetings, phone calls, and letters with managements or board of directors, as well as raising issues and filing resolutions at AGMs. You can do that both individually and collaboratively. Engagements means being an active owner. Isn't that strange that the concept totally has been lost on us? I'm not sure how it was when you did your first economy class, or even in primary school you learned that being a shareholder means you hold a share. That's not complicated. When you hold a share, you have a share. You own that share. You're an owner of that company. And as the Dutch SIF, we own 3 shares of all the listed companies in Holland. So we are an owner. That means we are responsible. If you own a dog, you are responsible for that dog. It's not a very polite thing, but you have to take care of them. If you have children, take care of the children. You're responsible also for what they are doing. That concept, however simple and easy to understand, is totally lost on us. Nowadays, institutional investors, luckily it's changing, see a share more as a lot on the lottery. A piece of paper to gain money very quickly if you're smart enough. If you're very smart, you trade it 1,000 or 10,000 times per second. That's smart. Has nothing to do with the concept of ownership, let alone active ownership. We have to bring the concept back. It's easy. Sustainability is not even complicated. So, then we find out that actually engagement is used a lot in Europe. These are European figures. You see over the year that the total assets under management that are included, covered by engagement, is 2 trillion. However, total assets under management Europe is 14 trillion. And you have to understand that some of those engagements is also, of course, these are European investors, but they have assets outside of Europe as well, of course. So the real percentage in Europe is probably a lot smaller than that. What is it, 5% or so? It's probably a lot smaller than that. And here you have to take care, because if an investor indicates that all this amount is covered by engagement, in reality, they have only the resources to engage with 100 to 200 companies on a portfolio of what will be on average 2,000, 3,000 companies perhaps. So it's a very small percentage that they really actively engage with. So what are the relevant countries where this is happening? Well, as you see, the Netherlands and the UK really stick out. That has a lot to do with responsible investment. You'll see also later that the main ways of investing sustainably in these countries is by ESG integration and to some extent by exclusion. And you can combine both of those methods very well with engagement. And then you have what I call a responsible strategy. Now, why would you do all this work? Why would you do all this engagement? What does it lead to? It actually costs a lot of effort if you do it seriously. Well, first of all, it will, of course, maximize your risk-adjusted returns, which seems to be a main reason for investors. And it reduces your reputational risk. So actually, what you could do is be the conscience a bit of companies. First thing that happens with engagement is that you ask data from companies, perhaps data that they do not always publish, but still you could ask in private also for data. So there's an information exchange, and that information exchange will help you to allocate your capital in the best way possible. Of course, it's relevant to also advance ethical or moral considerations. I always have to smile at these kind of conferences, because the moment you mention the word ethical, people just, they are like stung by a bee or something, because why could you talk about ethical? It's not us to decide, it's the money from our participants. Well, of course, even if you decide not to engage, that's an ethical discussion. So ethics is just about doing the right things. And of course there are ethical considerations. The whole discussion about controversial weapons is an ethical discussion as well as about corruption. But there are also business and reputational elements attached to that. Of course you want to contribute to sustainable development. And here's something, interest is popping up. When I would ask a pension fund like 7 years ago, why they wouldn't invest sustainably at that time, they would raise their hands and say, oh, that's all very well, but we are bound by our fiduciary duty. We cannot invest sustainably. Strange, because there was enough data already, but they said there's not enough data. 5 years later, talking to that same group, they would say, oh, stop talking, Giuseppe, because we do have to invest sustainable, because it's part of our fiduciary duty. The whole thing had flipped around 180 degrees. Why? Because pension funds, of course, are long-term investors. They see the trends coming, and those trends have a figure, they have a value. The overpopulation, the shortage of energy, the shortage of raw materials, the shortage of water, clean air, etc. They have a value. Companies that have solutions for those problems that are real, they have a competitive advantage, so they just will win. And if you invest in those companies and more research showing up, you win. So it helps to engage with those companies, to help them have the right focus, keep the right focus. Finally, what about the companies themselves? These are good reasons for investors. Do companies like engagement? Do companies really like it when you knock on their door and ask them more nasty questions and more information and more data? Yes, they do like it. They do like it a lot. Because finally you have people that stick with them, that think with them, not against them, they think with them. And there are investors that want to stay, that don't leave tomorrow when it's not right or when something happens they don't like. They stick with you, they talk to you, and that is very important. One day I was asking questions to TNT, to Peter Bakker, who is now the director of the World Business Council of Sustainable Development. And I said, why don't you this and this? And he looked at me, he paused for a second, and he said, yes, I better do it, because I know you will be back here next year. And that's exactly what we did, and that's exactly what institutional investors more and more are doing. So don't be afraid. Even the most sustainable CEO of the world needs support from his shareholders. If there's no support, he has to drop it. There will be questions from his other board members saying, hey, is this your hobby or so? Why do you do this? Nobody wants it. So you need the support. Don't underestimate that element. It's far too often that I go to companies, I speak to board members, and they say, yeah, I think it's the right way, we're doing that, but I never hear any of our institutional investors talk about these things. And yet, these investors have policies on sustainability. Engagement in practice, well, this kind of a clear-cut thing, I would say. You start, of course, by defining your policy. What do you want to engage with? You communicate, it's very important, to the companies. So, for instance, you might want to engage on certain specific teams or in a specific sector. Phase 2 is then you monitor those companies that you selected in your portfolio. That can be quite some work if you have 2,000 or 3,000 companies, but then again you might want to make a selection about the largest companies or the companies that are the most material in that element. Then you have to decide on the achievable objectives, so try to be concrete so you can measure them, and that's sometimes quite complicated. Of course you're going to ask questions, check the reports, check the available information, and you evaluate. That's phase 4, and then you have to see what you do with the outcome. Are you satisfied or not? And if not, what are you going to do? Going to step up or not? And phase 5 is interesting. There's a long discussion, and I think a very old debate in more sustainable investors. Do you stick with the company if they really do not pick up what you're saying, or do you have to let them go? Some people would say, no, exclusion is never good, because then you lose contacts. Other people would say, even if I step out of a company, I still can engage with that company. And I have to show a signal. APG, the largest Dutch pension fund or asset manager of the pension fund, they stepped out of Walmart last year. And they made it public. And it has kind of a large effect on other institutional investors. Say, hey, somebody's making a move because, and they said, well, we talked to them for 3, 4, 5 years on the issue of freedom of association, and they wouldn't listen. So we have to take a decision. So and that gives a kind of shockwave through the institutional investor community. It helps. Mostly investment engagement is done privately in one-on-one meetings. You see that voting of shares is even more important, but I have to warn you here. Voting on shares, I do not think this is in one-on-one things. This is like, you can also outsource the whole thing. You would vote with a proxy voter, and you actually have no clue what you're voting for. You probably vote with the management all the time. But really private engagement or collaborative engagement, these are important things. And then, of course, if you go filing shareholder resolutions, you'll find them at the bottom, because this is really something, it's more at the other side of the ocean, in the States, where they use these kind of things, and filing shareholder resolutions, the same thing. Just one thing about collaborative engagement, I think it's a very good thing. I'm sure, Pira, you can tell a little more about your efforts in this area. From my perspective, I can quote you one example. I always like examples because they illustrate something. I remember a situation at Ahold, a large supermarket chain with large chains also in the States, and there was the same issue as with Walmart. There was a lack of freedom of association. You could not become a member of a union in Ahold. And if you ever have time, you have to find on YouTube Ahold at Risk, Ahold at Risk. You see exactly in 7 minutes how this process goes in a shareholder meeting. Perhaps you have time to watch it later on. But it's really good, because there's one person stepping up. This was one person of my team, and he asked a question. The president of Ahold, he's a tough cookie, he's French, and he said, go sit down, you didn't understand a bit about this thing. Then what happened is that the pension funds gets up, and he speaks on behalf of a couple of pension funds to the clearinghouse. And he says, no, wait a moment, we have the same issue here, and we also don't like it. The president, instead of backing down a bit, he's closing up, coming up. Now it gets serious. So he says, no, you don't totally understand. We have a good point, we take care of it, everybody can join a union, blah, blah, blah. Then more people stand up. Actually, then a union steps up. They brought in some people from the States, people that work in the supermarket. And you know what he says? He says, did you got a letter from your management? Well, you should have stayed at home. It's a waste of time to come here. If you have an issue with your management, you go to your management. He forgets that he is the owner of the company. He is the company. And it gets that far that even the association of private shareholders who are totally not sustainable, but they stand up and they said, well, this is governance-wise not good what's happening, because your shareholders ask you something you're just denying. And then even private shareholders, like elderly ladies, stand up and say, well, this is a disgrace. And then finally he has to back up. It's a long story, but what I try to tell you is that if you work together, even the most toughest guy in this case, they have to get in to the moment. If you see it's really a thing that's broadly asked for, he has to do this. By the way, if you ever watch that video, at the end of the time you will see it's still not solved. In the meanwhile, we've seen another AGM, and after that AGM, he finally implemented the changes. I'll try to wrap up. Still quite some sheets, but I'm aware of the time, so I'll try to wrap up in 5 minutes. Engagement, like I said, is often used with other strategies, mostly with ESG integration. These, of course, are used by large institutions, like large banks are using, for instance, a very limited exclusion policy, and they combine it with engagement, and they say, well, everything now is responsible investment. In a Dutch context, I know that practically all insurance companies are working with ESG integration, and they want to combine it, they do combine it with engagement. And here you see it, the same figures actually, but also its perspective. This is from the last Eurosif SRI study. So what you see is exclusions is, let's say, the biggest part of what we call sustainable and responsible investment, and then integration. And of course, if you've read the studies, there's big differences across Europe. Exclusion is very much used in Germany, best in class, very much used in France. In ESG integration, much more in the UK, in the north, and in the Netherlands. But you see, the dark part is the part that's combined with engagement. So ESG integration almost always is combined with engagement. Then, disclosure. Here's a way to go, because if you look to the light blue, that's engagement itself. Only 35% of investors in Europe have a formal policy. That's not so much. Disclosing it is 24%, and disclosing the outcomes only 16%. That's not a lot. They can improve. If you really want to represent your participants, then you have to be more clear. Even worse is the voting part. The voting part is not disclosed at all. I know some companies that do, some investors. It takes some work, but they explain how they voted. I think it's very important, because voting at the end of the day, engagement is relevant behind closed doors. But the AGM, that's the arena, you could say, where it's all happening. There you have to speak up or speak out. So this is really the area for improvement, I would say, for institutional investors. Then the question is, how do you measure the outcomes? Well, it's challenging. It's challenging because you can't ask for so many things. You can ask for a transparent annual report. You could ask for more, for a good policy at the company on CSR, and that's defended by the CEO and by the supervisory board. You can ask for specific issues like CO2 or water or energy use or waste. You can ask for the report to be checked independently. You can ask, do we have a stakeholder dialogue? There's many, many questions. How do you measure what has been reached? Well, first of all, you can do it qualitatively, of course. If you ask for CO2 output, well, this is actually, you could measure it. If you ask for freedom of association or human rights issues, usually these are qualitative. Some you can measure, like I said, CO2 or energy use or water use, percentage of recycling, that you can measure. That's qualitative. In terms of alpha, this kind of complicated, because you never know what your contribution is. Actually, that's also true for the first two. You never know if it's due to your engagement, because others are influencing that company also. And in terms of alpha, that's kind of the same thing. It's very hard to have this relationship, but it is. There is more and more, of course, and I do not think I have to repeat it in this audience, but there's a lot of evidence that sustainable companies, they yield better results. There are some examples, but I'm not going to go through them. If you want to hear more about them, I'm gladly explain them. Like here is the 1/4 AP funds. We have Etica, we have Doty Hansen, a private equity firm. They're all very active. Natixis, all active, all good examples where what they do and where it works. My last slide, and then I have a short wrap up, is what can policymakers do? Basically, there's quite some things. First of all, we can ask for, of course, for mandatory ESG corporate disclosure. If there's no data, you cannot discuss. What I always say is that there's two pillars under any ESG or CSR policy. One pillar is transparency, the other is stakeholder dialogue. But you can also say, in this case, shareholder dialogue. If there are no data, there's no dialogue. There's nothing to talk about. But if there's no good dialogue with people you trust that are going to be there long term, they're going to be with you, it is hard to get data from companies because there's a mistrust. So both are important. Policymakers can ask for a strong corporate disclosure, like what's happening, of course, now in the EU, where they're discussing a non-financial disclosure. We can incentivize investor stewardship by having smart regulation, for instance, including it in fiduciary duty. I think what's happening here, and I see it in more countries, that pension funds are asked to describe their policy on ESG, on sustainability, on non-financial matter, including what they do on engagement is relevant. You can also have voluntary codes, like in the UK, the stewardship code, and in the Netherlands have a similar code. You can remove technical barriers, for instance, the acting in concert, that makes it hard to combine together. So the share blocking, that's an important thing. You know, forget about that. Make sure people, if you have a share of a company, you're an owner, you have to be responsible. You don't go to lend the shares to somebody else. And of course, they can ask for investor disclosure. Let investors see what they can do. So basically, wrapping up, the previous speaker spoke about a social contract, and I think that's a key element. And in this social contract, everybody has to take up their own responsibility. Don't wait for the others. The last couple of weeks, I've been sitting in several panels of high-level people, of intelligent, clever, expert people. But when they are on a panel, sometimes it seems they get 30, 40 years younger until they were very small children. Because always they say things like, yeah, there is a problem here at hand, but basically it's not our fault. We didn't do it. It's because the legislation didn't do it, the investors didn't do it, the people don't want it, the companies don't move, the NGOs are nasty. It's always somebody else. But this sustainability thing is now really the opposite. It's taking your own responsibility. That way you get the social cohesion. We measure, we talked about pension funds and about insurance companies. In Holland we have a benchmark for pension funds. We measure how sustainable they operate. 2 out of the 9 indicators have to do with engagement and with voting. So you have to make sure that you take up your own responsibility. Don't wait for the others. Start yourself. Take leadership. The director of the financial authority in the Netherlands said in a newspaper 2 months ago, the financial sector lacks leadership. And the former director of the Dutch National Bank said, the social contract between society and the financial sector is breached. Those are quite strong words from financial people. Those are quite strong words. So the question is, what can a financial world do to take up that leadership? And I very much liked the previous speaker because she was talking about taking action. And the whole thing, whatever we say in this report, is all theory. They're all data. That's how it should be. But it's not what's happening. I mean, what you can do with it. And I'll give you one example and then I close. When I was at the Shell meeting, Shell was mentioned. I was in the shareholder meeting 2 years ago. We had a resolution. If Shell wanted to do a bit more research before they entered into this tar sands projects. Not only because of the environment, because also there are reputational risks, but also there are real risks. And of course Shell strongly advised against it. And then the whole thing was rejected with 80%, I think. Afterwards, I was checking what our Dutch pension funds had voted. Because those pension funds had policies, they had targets, they were specific what they couldn't do. And it turned out only 1 out of those pension funds voted in favor of the resolutions. All the others just voted with the management. So what I say is you can have nice policies and put them in a drawer or put them on the wall even. But if they're not implemented, if you're not really taking care of following what you write, if your doing doesn't follow your heart and your head, it's not going to work. And that's why explanation and discussion with your own participants and your own customers are very important. So this leadership I wish to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josep. En relación con la presentación de Josep, vamos a tener el informe en la web de SpainShift. También vamos a colgar la presentación que ha hecho y quien quiera profundizar un poco en cuál es la situación en España, tenemos un estudio de hace 2 años al que pueden acceder también sobre el engagement en España, con lo cual con esta información contrastada con la situación podemos tener una información completa, ¿no? Bien, vamos a pasar ahora, voy a presentarles el informe de este año de SpainShift, informe realizado por Novaster y bueno, lo primero agradecer la colaboración de distintos investigadores a nivel internacional, mencionar en representación del resto a Simonetta Bono, de Villeo, y bueno, lo primero, ya entrando, marcar unas referencias de cómo tiene que ser la lectura de este informe. No es un estudio académico ni tampoco una recopilación normativa, sino es un informe técnico. la recopilación de toda la normativa concreta a nivel de país y en nuestro entorno comunitario lo tienen dentro de la información de Eurosif, de un estudio del año pasado en el que vienen todas las circulares, todos los documentos. Por lo tanto, lo que hace este informe es contemplar la regulación en un sentido amplio, con referencias, pero incorporando aspectos cualitativos y, además, incorporando tanto la normativa de derecho positivo, la de obligado cumplimiento y otros esquemas de regulación, pondríamos entre paréntesis la autorregulación, la regulación soft, más que viene de consensos internos. Y, además, se entra al detalle de cada uno de los marcos regulatorios en los países de nuestro entorno uno a uno. Bueno, se trata de incorporar experiencias viendo estas iniciativas y entender cuáles pueden ser útiles como una guía para el futuro modelo español. Tenemos mucho que recorrer y bueno, se trata de tener una visión global, cualitativa de alguna manera, y ver los distintos caminos que se nos abren viendo las experiencias de los países que tienen un desarrollo mayor. Bien, las conclusiones son abiertas, no se cierran aspectos, sino que quedan abiertas buscando abrir vías de debate. SpainSys es un foro, entre otras cosas, también de debate y que recoge opiniones desde distintas visiones, con lo cual este informe nos va a servir internamente para hacer nuestras valoraciones y para ir encauzando estas vías de acercamiento a posibles planteamientos e iniciativas que surjan. Entonces, este es un poco las características y el marco del estudio. Y lo primero, centrarnos que el título, como bien dice, habla de la normativa comparada europea en la ISR Retail. Cierto que la ISR Retail tiene un desarrollo normativo, como veremos, muy escaso, y que, sobre todo, la parte normativa de obligado cumplimiento va ligada con la inversión ISR institucional, pero una va conectando con la otra y va provocando cómo se generan iniciativas que, sobre todo, como veremos, van a ir ligadas en la parte de la autorregulación. Bueno, la escasez de regulación se liga mucho también con la situación de la ISR minorista en Europa. Y de aquí los datos para que veamos, cuando hablamos de regulación de la ISR, qué estamos midiendo. A nivel europeo, en el estudio del 2012 ya marca como el peso de la inversión socialmente responsable minorista, retail, es muy escasa. Estamos hablando del 6%. El 94% es inversión institucional. Por lo tanto, tenemos que tener claro esto. En España todavía es más. En España el 97% es institucional, el 3% sería retail, y si lo ligamos con la parte de inversión, los activos en fondos de inversión, instituciones de inversión colectiva, pues no llegamos al 1%. Entonces, bueno, tenemos que situar esto, pero lo mismo que hablamos de esa escasa presencia, sí que tenemos que ver cómo en el estudio de Villeo del 2012 recoge cómo esto va progresando, y con los datos globales, pues bueno, hay un crecimiento importante año a año, y en el 2012, siendo un importe bajo, estamos ya a nivel europeo en los 94.773 millones de euros. Lo importante es la progresión, no el dato absoluto, que es poco representativo. Bien, y si nos vamos a quién es quién en el mundo de la inversión socialmente responsable minorista, tenemos aquí los datos. Vemos que Francia es el gran peso. Francia aporta el 44% del total de la ISR Retail europea. Le sigue Gran Bretaña, Suiza, Bélgica, Alemania y el resto de países. Nos vemos a nosotros mismos ahí atrás, en fin, hablamos de los 1.000 millones que casi no llegan. Bien, entonces, lo que está claro es que el 83% de los activos europeos, el 83% en la ISR minorista, están centrados en los 5 primeros países. Francia, Gran Bretaña, Suiza, Bélgica y Alemania representan el 83% de toda la ISR retail europea. Y destacar Francia con el 44%. Esta lectura, en términos absolutos, la tenemos que contrastar con la que viene en el gráfico siguiente del estudio. No lo he querido incluir porque puede generar confusión. Entonces, en el siguiente gráfico que tienen en el estudio viene representado la cuota de mercado y ahí nos salen cifras distintas. Donde en términos absolutos Francia tiene un 44% del total, pues solo representa el 2,8% del mercado. Por lo tanto, ¿quiénes son en ese sentido quienes más porcentaje aportan? Pues está Bélgica, curiosamente, que no aparece con los volúmenes globales, y está Holanda. Entonces, el peso, Francia, Gran Bretaña, Suiza y Bélgica y Holanda con un porcentaje muy elevado en cuanto a representación. Bien, con este contexto de cifras nos vamos ya a la normativa. Perdón, vamos a llamarle a la reglamentación porque incorpora la normativa de derecho positivo y la parte de regulación más de consenso. Les he incorporado aquí, y esto podría haber ido antes o después. En definitiva, aquí hay unas referencias básicas que para que se desarrolle la ISR minorista tiene que haber un sector financiero maduro, con un nivel de desarrollo, con una organización y eficiencia en el sector, tiene que haber una regulación, pero además de eso, que es general, tiene que haber una visión ética y una madurez profesional de sus miembros. Y luego el marco regulatorio se desarrollará en normas de derecho positivo. Hay, como veremos ahora, tenemos distintos ejemplos. Habrá una gran parte de autorregulación, que es la experiencia europea, asociaciones de gestoras de Bélgica, bueno, distintos ejemplos que luego veremos a lo largo de la exposición. Está toda la parte de certificaciones, labels, que también tendremos la ocasión de verlo, y luego tiene que haber un consenso general sobre lo que la regulación debe contemplar. Entonces, sería un marco necesario y ya entraríamos en lo que es la regulación concreta. En la regulación europea, más allá de, bueno, pues de remitirnos a lo que es el estudio de Eurosif del 2012, en la página 20 viene la parte de marco normativo, con lo cual viene todo el detalle y no lo vamos a mencionar, pero sí destacar pues, cinco iniciativas relevantes por orden de antigüedad: el Libro Verde de la Comisión Europea del 2001, la Directiva de las Cuentas Anuales y Consolidadas del 2003, que ya incorpora la necesidad de informar. Sobre todo, la regulación va ligada a aspectos de transparencia e información de criterios ambientales, sociales y de gobierno que se van aplicando. Bien, ya posteriormente la Estrategia de Responsabilidad Social Corporativa 2011-2014 de la Unión Europea, que va incluyendo estos contenidos, y posteriormente ya iniciativas sobre información y comunicación que se están debatiendo en este momento sobre los reportes y la inclusión de los aspectos ESG y la información al inversor retail en el documento, en la información de los KIT, que en este momento se está desarrollando también. Y luego incluimos también el Código de Transparencia porque se suma, el Código de Transparencia europeo, que se suma a las distintas formas de consenso alineadas con la inversión socialmente responsable. Seguidamente vamos a ver la regulación en los países más significativos, partiendo por el país que más, o el mercado que más peso tiene, por Francia, que representa el 44%. Y aquí les he incluido, la presentación la van a tener disponible y el detalle de los contenidos lo tienen en el informe. Dentro de estas dos leyes, más luego iniciativas promovidas ligadas con los planes de ahorro salarial y el informe de julio de 2013 y la certificación de los labels, con el caso de Novetic, yo en la parte de regulación francesa querría subrayar, por un lado, hay una normativa importante de carácter obligatorio. Seguramente es el país que subraya más este aspecto. La ley de julio del 2012, Grenelle II, es de obligado cumplimiento. y además incluye no solo, abarca todos los inversores, desde las sociedades de gestión de patrimonios como el resto de empresas no cotizadas, pymes y las empresas públicas, y tienen que informar de si tienen en cuenta o no los aspectos relacionados con el desarrollo sostenible. Con lo cual, esta ley, la Granel 2, es importante desde el punto de vista de disposición normativa de obligado cumplimiento, y luego, sumado a esa, la normativa de los planes de ahorro salarial. Se lo promueve el CIES, que son los sindicatos franceses, y desde el 2008, y esto es importante porque no viene en la transparencia, pero viene en el informe, es obligatorio ofrecer un fondo solidario en los planes de ahorro salarial. Y el 90% es ISR y el 10% son inversiones de impacto. Bueno, destacar esas dos normas que son de carácter obligatorio y que destacan lo que es la parte de aportación en la regulación francesa. Si nos vamos a la regulación en el Reino Unido, destacaríamos sobre todo el UK, el Stewardship Code y el NEST. Comentaré el Stewardship Code. Realmente, en estos dos casos, las dos normativas que destacamos se refieren a una normativa soft, más de consenso y que, de alguna forma, además, tienen un nivel de respuesta muy importante. Va relacionado también con la cultura financiera del entorno de ese mercado. Entonces, marcar esas referencias y, pues sí que existe una normativa en cuanto a obligado cumplimiento en los sistemas de planes de pensiones de empleo y luego en la parte del NEST es importante en el sentido de que estamos hablando de sistemas de pensiones de empleo por defecto y que aplican la ISR a todos sus activos. Es una referencia en este momento en el sector financiero y por esa obligatoriedad de ofrecer productos ISR y además con una opción de ofrecer un producto puramente ético. Si vemos la normativa de Suiza, representa un 53% de la ISR retail en el total del mercado. Suiza es una referencia clave, pero ya es un enfoque que desde el artículo 73 de la Constitución habla de un equilibrio sostenible y relacionado con la naturaleza. Ya hay una mentalidad muy ligada a aspectos medioambientales y de sostenibilidad, y destacar sobre todo el libro blanco sobre el proceso para convertir a Suiza en un centro financiero sostenible mundial. Este es un documento que recoge distintas iniciativas, pero globaliza en todas ellas enfocadas a una relación de sostenibilidad, como una visión global. Otro de los mercados con una cuota importante es Bélgica, el 23% de cuota de mercado minorista. Bélgica es un país importante desde el punto de vista de actividad en la parte de la ISR Retail. Destacar la metodología desarrollada por la Asociación Belga de Gestión de Patrimonios y por Fedelfin, que es la Federación del Sector Financiero. Realmente es una metodología ligada con la inversión socialmente responsable, con la parte de indicadores, y que además se está generalizando y está permitiendo una activación importante en productos de inversión socialmente responsable retail. Si nos vamos a la normativa alemana, recoge desde una recopilación de normas de obligado cumplimiento desde el 2001 hasta los códigos de sostenibilidad del 2011, que de alguna forma lo que hacen es establecer un marco voluntario y en el cual realmente hay 52 empresas adheridas y que está consiguiendo que de una forma consensuada se vaya desarrollando los temas dirigidos a la ISR Retail. Mencionar en cuanto a la regulación en Holanda, de la cual Josep nos puede dar una lección magistral. Hay bastantes puntos que merece la pena destacar. Yo me quedaría con el Código de Inversión Responsable, en la medida en que tiene una aceptación importante, afecta a las compañías aseguradoras, que son muy activas en Holanda, y contempla aspectos medioambientales, sociales y de gobierno corporativo, aplicando los principios del Pacto Mundial y los de los PRI. Pero, ojo, la importancia que tiene es que están adheridos a este código el equivalente al 95% de las primas de seguros en Holanda, con lo cual la penetración es muy importante y este es un código que tiene una referencia clave, ¿no? Respecto a Austria, mencionaría las certificaciones, tanto la de la Sociedad Austríaca del Medio Ambiente como el label de calidad ambiental en productos financieros. Gracias. Si nos vamos a la regulación italiana, destacaríamos la Carta del Investimento Sostenible y Responsable, que realmente recoge, es un acuerdo estratégico, está firmado recientemente, en junio del 2012, y cubre a todos los representantes de la Asociación Italiana de Banca, aseguradoras y gestores de inversiones, con lo cual todos los colectivos han firmado este documento, que es una referencia fundamental. Bien, ya la regulación noruega, de Dinamarca, Finlandia y de Suecia apenas tienen una normativa concreta, únicamente detallarlas hay más información, y pasaríamos a las conclusiones. Dentro de las conclusiones, ya hemos ido mencionando, hay una escasa regulación normativa y, sobre todo, está referida al deber de información en la aplicación de los criterios ESG en los planes de pensiones. Estamos hablando de inversión institucional y aquí tenemos, bueno, pues la regulación del Reino Unido del 2000, Francia del 2001, Alemania 2001, Suecia 2001, Bélgica 2004, Italia 2004, Austria 2005 y en España el 2011. Bien, la mayor parte de regulación que vamos a ver en el informe es autorregulación y los acercamientos en los distintos mercados son diferentes, desde acuerdos sectoriales, acuerdos globales, certificaciones y luego hay aspectos de derecho positivo en cuanto a normativa, en algunos casos de incentivación desde el punto de vista fiscal. Alguna iniciativa del Gobierno francés y en Holanda también temas de compensación. Bien, nos quedamos, esta es la última transparencia, con lo cual estas son algunas de las pautas. Como hemos indicado, esto queda abierto, abre un debate interno también dentro de la asociación, pero como unas pautas ya por entrar en temas concretos, si tenemos que coger detalles, vemos que dentro de las normativas de obligado cumplimiento nos quedaríamos con el modelo francés, con la obligación de informar en materia de criterios de ESG y ofrecer opciones ISR. Hemos visto que el modelo francés establecía ya con carácter obligatorio determinados puntos que podían servir como referencia. Y estamos hablando de los planes de ahorro salarial, con la obligación de ofrecer fondos solidarios. Estamos hablando de la ley de julio del 2012, la Grenelle II, la obligación de informar. Bueno, tenemos una normativa de derecho positivo especialmente elaborada. En cuanto a medidas cuasi normativas, nos iríamos al modelo de Reino Unido, en el que hemos visto tanto el Stewardship Code como el sistema del NEST, que realmente está teniendo y está siendo una gran referencia. En cuanto a otro de los acercamientos puede ser el de los acuerdos de asociaciones sectoriales, y aquí nos quedaríamos con el último, con el modelo, con el acuerdo global, el italiano. Y en cuanto a códigos de autorregulación, tenemos el de transparencia europeo, el de Eurosif, y el de los aseguradores de Holanda, que hemos mencionado, que tiene un nivel de respuesta tan importante. Distinguimos la parte de certificaciones, labels. El de Novetic en Francia tiene una importancia y a nivel de Europa está adquiriendo una relevancia clave. Y en cuanto a posiciones globales, entendemos que un ejemplo puede ser el de la plaza financiera de Suiza, que destaca el aspecto de transparencia y, como hemos mencionado al hablar de Suiza, incorpora un plan nacional para hacer de Suiza el país de referencia a nivel de inversión sostenible. Como han visto, queda abierto. Realmente todo esto va a generar pues un trabajo sobre este informe y abrir distintas vías que iremos de alguna forma elaborando y consensuando. Sin más, muchas gracias. Y bueno, si tienen alguna pregunta, si acaso cuando termine la exposición, Karin, abrimos un turno. ¿Les parece? Muy bien, muchas gracias. Como les he mencionado, las transparencias irán en español y Karin Malberg nos hará la presentación en inglés. Karin, your turn. If you want, I can add the...
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much. Buenos días. So my name is not Maria Laura Tinelli, but Karin Malmberg. Maria, who speaks Spanish, is in London with a bad flu, so I'm here instead, and thank you for accepting this last-minute change. She sends her apologies, and I apologize for speaking in English, but I hope it will go okay. So I'm a colleague of Maria. I work in the team that has produced some of the publications that I'll speak to you about today. So maybe if we just go to the next slide. So these are examples of some of the publications that we have put out this year. I'm going to give an overview of the first three in a bit more detail, but just I guess one point what all these publications have in common is that they have come about from speaking with our signatories, finding out what are the challenges that they face, what are the questions, the big issues for them in responsible investing. So I thought I'd just go through these case studies one by one to explain what questions they're trying to address, and that will give you an idea what these publications are about. I've brought copies of some of these. They're at the registration desk. You can also download them from our website, which is www.unpri.org. Okay, so starting from the left, aligning expectations. Guidance for asset owners on incorporating ESG factors in selection, appointment, and monitoring. This publication tries to address what we've seen as a lack of alignment between, on the one hand, incentives and behavior of investment managers, and on the other, what asset owner beliefs and expectations when it comes to responsible investing. The second, still on the same, we'll stay on the same page for a while, sorry. If you just go back to the publications, so one back. Yep. Sorry, I'll just quickly run through these publications and then I'll go in more detail about the first three. So the second one from the left, integrated analysis, how investors are incorporating ESG factors in fundamental equity analysis. This publication tries to address the lack of, or at least lack of visibility around investment manager and broker research that integrates ESG in fundamental analysis. The next one, the third one, sovereign bonds, spotlight on ESG risks, addresses really the lack of knowledge and the lack of understanding in the investment community of the link between ESG risks and ESG factors and credit risk. So those are the three that I'll speak a bit more about, but just to briefly mention the other two, The integration of ESG issues in M&A transactions summarizes the results of a survey we did with trade buyers. So this tries to address the issue of the materiality of ESG factors in private equity, looking at exits. And then finally, building the capacity of investment actors to use ESG information. That's what it does. It talks about what the lack of understanding is in the investment community. So not just asset owners and investment managers, but also service providers, NGOs, and business schools. Right, so just one point about these publications. We're not trying to give answers. It's not the role of PRI to be prescriptive. We're not telling investors what to do or not to do. Instead, what we want to do is to highlight examples from all over the world of investors' experiences, case studies, and really to stimulate debate. So when you look at these publications, you will see interesting examples of innovative approaches, forward thinking from all over the world. Where possible, we've tried to draw out commonalities to provide a bit of guidance to investors as well. So I should say as well that in these 5 publications, they've come out of interviews with actors in the investment community, and in total for these 5, that's 180 interviews. I added them up yesterday. And in addition, of course, other investors have been involved in an advisory capacity in some of the working groups that have supported the development of these. So, yeah, I hope that you will read these publications if they're of interest, that you will use them, and that you will criticize them, discuss these issues with your peers. The point is really to further understanding of these issues. So I'll give a bit more detail on the first 3. I have a lot of slides. I'm not going to go through all of them because I don't have a lot of time. I'd be happy to distribute them after the event. As you said, they're all in Spanish as well, which is another reason I won't go through them all, because I don't actually understand what they say. So, okay, so yeah, if we go to the next one. So this is the first publication about aligning the expectations of asset owners and investment managers. We've included a lot of examples, sort of mini case studies that follow this model, which we've identified as a sort of best practice, where the first step for asset owners is actually to develop, identify and formalize what their expectations are, what ESG factors are material to your organization, how do you think responsible investing should be approached, and so on. Then you communicate with your investment managers through the selection, appointment, and monitoring. And this is a continuous process, so organizations change, the world changes, so this should be reviewed continuously. If we actually skip a few more slides, so we could get to this slide. Yeah. So this is the next publication that I'll touch on. So this is the integrated analysis publication, which again is a collection of case studies. They're a bit more in detail. So these are examples of really kind of progressive, forward investment management and broker research, and we've organized them according to this sort of standardized stock review, so economic analysis, industry analysis, company strategy, financial reports, and valuation tools. I just want to touch on the conclusions from this work, because it's quite interesting. So there are 7 conclusions, and the first one is that high-quality research that integrates ESG does exist. We have 20 great examples here. Since we published this study, we've been able to highlight more at different events, and research keeps coming in. Also, they follow standard research structures, so these can be used by any mainstream investor. 3, there's a tension between short and long-term time horizons. So what we found with these case studies is that quite often they're about ESG issues that we normally think about in the long term, but that have become more urgent, or other cases where investors have a very long-term view, which is not typical. We also found that, as you'll know, I'm sure, that ESG research is lots more resource intensive, and that's because there just isn't the same sort of standardized, comparable data on ESG as there are for other factors that will come into financial analysis. The 5th thing we found was that companies do more than they disclose, so it's another issue around reporting. 6th conclusion is that raw ESG data can be misleading, needs to be put into context. And finally, the materiality of ESG, identifying that materiality is still an art. It's not a science. There are no ready answers or models. Yep, so then the 3rd report, if we can move maybe to this slide. This one here. I think that's the first one we have. Yeah. Yes, so this is one of our most recent publications on fixed income. And this is one of the areas that our signatories find the most interesting for 2 reasons. One is the sheer size of fixed income. I think we saw on some of the slides earlier this morning what big share fixed income has in most pension fund portfolios. In total, the sovereign fixed income market stands at $47 trillion. So that's one reason, and the other is that for a long time these were considered risk-free assets, which I think in the last few years we've all seen that they're not. So just very briefly, the main findings of this report, which again is based on, we can stay on that slide actually. Again, it's using case studies, real examples from investors, also academic and industry research. And what we found is that ESG analysis can give additional insight into sovereign credit risk. There are multiple studies that show the correlation between ESG factors and credit risk. The second finding is that ESG factors can be material. There's a correlation between sovereign credit risk, sovereign credit worthiness, and also investment performance, we've seen in some studies. Finally, all the investors that we spoke to, there was real impetus on the credit rating agencies to take ESG factors into account more systematically, using both quantitative and qualitative criteria. So that's just a quick overview of those three reports. I wanted to mention one more, just on the slide. Just picking up on Giuseppe's presentation. So this one that says clearinghouse, it doesn't have a number. There we go. Yeah. So we've put out a handbook recently, specifically on collaborative engagements, and we have. So the clearinghouse, is PRI's online platform for investors to engage together with listed companies. And we also have a big team that supports our signatories in doing this. And they've recently put out this report, which, similar to some of the slides that you were showing, sort of talks about the benefits of engaging collaboratively, also some of the challenges. We talk about what are the elements needed for success and the different stages of collaborative investments collaborative engagements. And we include 5 comprehensive case studies of successful collaborative engagements in there as well. I think just a last thing, we can go to this slide, was just to it's just to advertise. I mean, if you're interested in research, we have particularly academic research. We have a couple of events coming up where we get academics and investors together to discuss responsible investment research. One is in Paris, 13th to 15th of November, and also one in Singapore on 20th of November. So that's all of my presentation. Muchas gracias. Apologies for rushing through a bit. There's a lot here. So I encourage you, if any of this sounded interesting, to take a look. I put big stacks of presentations at registration desk. They're all available on our website. So again, that's www.unpri.org. You can also find out more about if you want to sign on to the PRI, so as to engage more on these issues. Or if you're already a PRI signatory, also different ways that you can join us in this discussion. So thank you very much.